23 years. That's how long I had been waiting for this moment, sitting in the sterile fluorescent lighting of the state parole board hearing room. The plastic chair beneath me was uncomfortable, designed more for function than comfort. Much like everything else in the criminal justice system I'd come to know so intimately. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Detective Sarah, though I haven't carried that badge in over 2 decades. The woman sitting across from me, her hands folded primly in her lap, had no idea who I was. To her, I was just another witness, another voice in the chorus of people who would determine whether Marcus Webb walked free today. But I knew exactly who she was. Linda Webb, Marcus's devoted wife of 35 years. The woman who had visited him every month without fail, who had maintained his innocence through every appeal, every hearing, every sleepless night for the past quarter-century. She had aged gracefully despite the circumstances, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her navy dress conservative and respectful for the occasion. She believed in her husband's innocence with the fervor of a true believer. What she didn't know was that I had spent 23 years proving she was wrong. The door opened, and Marcus Webb shuffled in, his prison-issued clothing pressed and clean, his gray hair trimmed short. At 71, he looked every bit the reformed elder statesman his lawyer had painted him to be in the pre-hearing briefs. His eyes swept the room, taking in the parole board members, his wife, his attorney, and finally landing on me. He had no idea who I was either. Why would he? When he was arrested and convicted, I was Detective Sarah Chen, a rising star in the Metropolitan Police Department's Homicide Division. Now I was Dr. Sarah Chen, with a PhD in criminology and 20 years of experience as a forensic consultant. The transformation had been deliberate, necessary, and complete. But he was about to learn exactly who I was, and why I was here. "This hearing is called to order," announced Commissioner Patricia Hayes, the chairwoman of the parole board. "We are here today to consider the parole application of Marcus Webb, inmate number 847592, currently serving a life sentence for the murder of Detective James Morrison on March 15, 2001. The familiar pain shot through my chest at the mention of Jamie's name. Even after all these years, hearing it spoken aloud in an official capacity still had the power to steal my breath. He had been my partner, my mentor, and the closest thing to a father I'd ever known after losing my own parents in a car accident when I was 16. "Mr. Webb," Commissioner Hayes continued, "you have served 23 years of your sentence. You have maintained your innocence throughout your incarceration and have an exemplary prison record. Today, we will hear from various witnesses before making our determination." Marcus's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Thomas Brennan who specialized in post-conviction work, stood first. "Thank you, Commissioner Hayes. My client has spent over 2 decades behind bars for a crime he did not commit. The evidence will show that he was wrongfully convicted based on circumstantial evidence and prosecutorial misconduct." I kept my face neutral, though inside I was already mentally reviewing the evidence I'd spent years compiling. Brennan had done his homework, I'd give him that. The case against Marcus had indeed been largely circumstantial at the time of his conviction. But what the defense didn't know was that I had spent the last 23 years turning that circumstantial case into an ironclad certainty. Linda Webb was called first as a character witness. She approached the podium with dignity, her voice steady as she spoke about her husband's kindness, his dedication to their family, his volunteer work with at-risk youth before his arrest. She painted a picture of a man incapable of violence, someone who had been wrongfully torn from his family and community. "Marcus has never hurt anyone," she said, her voice finally cracking with emotion. "He's a good man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's paid for a crime he didn't commit for 23 years. Isn't that enough?" Several other character witnesses followed. Former co-workers who described Marcus as reliable and honest. A prison chaplain who spoke of his spiritual transformation and commitment to helping other inmates. A literacy program coordinator who praised his dedication to education and rehabilitation. With each testimony, I felt the familiar frustration building. These people genuinely believed in Marcus's innocence, and their testimonies were heartfelt and convincing. But they didn't know what I knew. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. Finally, Commissioner Hayes called my name. Dr. Sarah Chen, forensic consultant. I stood and walked to the podium, my footsteps echoing in the quiet room. As I adjusted the microphone, I caught Marcus's eyes. Still no recognition. Good. That would make this even more satisfying. Commissioner Hayes, members of the board, I began, my voice steady and professional. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I hold a PhD in criminology from Georgetown University and have worked as a forensic consultant for the past 20 years. But before that, I was Detective Sarah Chen of the Metropolitan Police Department. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I paused, watching as understanding slowly dawned on Marcus's face. His complexion went pale, and his hands gripped the edge of the table. I was Detective James Morrison's partner. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Linda Webb's face went white as she looked between her husband and me, confusion and fear warring in her expression. I was the detective who investigated his murder, I continued. I was the one who built the case that sent Marcus Webb to prison, and I am here today to tell you why he should never be released. Marcus's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. This is highly irregular. We weren't informed that the victim's former partner would be testifying. Commissioner Hayes consulted her notes. Dr. Chen properly registered as a witness within the required time frame. She may continue. I opened the thick folder I'd brought with me. 23 years of meticulous investigation condensed into hundreds of pages of evidence. Members of the board, when Marcus Webb was convicted in 2001, we had a strong circumstantial case. Physical evidence placing him at the scene, witness testimony, and a clear motive. But I knew it wasn't enough for me. Losing my partner nearly destroyed me, and I couldn't live with any doubt about whether we had the right man. I pulled out a photograph and placed it on the evidence table where the board could see it. This is Detective James Morrison. He was 42 years old, married with 2 children. He had been on the force for 18 years and had never once fired his weapon in the line of duty. He was investigating a series of armed robberies in the warehouse district when he was killed. Another photograph joined the first. This is the crime scene. Detective Morrison was found in an alley behind 1247 Industrial Boulevard, shot twice in the back. The ballistics report showed he was killed with a .38 caliber revolver that was never recovered. Marcus was sweating now, his breathing shallow. His wife reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his eyes fixed on me with growing horror. The initial investigation focused on Marcus Webb because he worked night security at a warehouse 3 blocks away, I continued. He had access to the area, knew the patrol patterns, and had a criminal record for armed robbery from his youth. When we arrested him, he claimed he was at home asleep, but had no one to corroborate his alibi since his wife was working a double shift at the hospital. I had practiced this presentation dozens of times in front of my bathroom mirror, but standing here now with Jamie's killer just feet away, I felt the old rage threatening to break through my professional composure. What the jury didn't hear during the trial, I said, my voice growing stronger, was the complete picture. Because I spent the next 23 years making sure we had the whole truth. I pulled out a manila envelope and removed several documents. In 2003, 2 years after Marcus Webb's conviction, I took a leave of absence from the police force to pursue advanced degrees in criminology and forensic science. Officially, it was for career advancement. Unofficially, it was because I could not let this case go. Commissioner Hayes leaned forward. Dr. Chen, while we appreciate your dedication, this hearing is about Mr. Webb's current suitability for parole, not a retrial of his original conviction. With respect, Commissioner, what I discovered directly relates to his suitability for release, I replied. Because Marcus Webb didn't just kill my partner. He's been lying about it for 23 years and he's been planning to kill again. The room erupted. Marcus's lawyer was on his feet shouting objections. Linda Webb was crying and Marcus himself had gone dead white. his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Commissioner Hayes banged her gavel. Order! Dr. Chen, these are serious allegations. I hope you have evidence to support them? I smiled grimly. I have more than evidence, Commissioner. I have a confession. I reached into my folder and pulled out a digital recorder, placing it on the table with deliberate care. This recording was made 6 months ago during a prison visit. A visit where Marcus Webb believed he was speaking to someone he could trust. Marcus found his voice at last. You can't do this! This is entrapment! I want my lawyer! His lawyer was already beside him, whispering urgently in his ear. I could see them calculating, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage from whatever was about to be revealed. The recording is completely legal, I said calmly. It was made with full consent of both parties and follows all applicable laws regarding prison recordings. Marcus Webb knew he was being recorded, as is standard procedure for all prison visits. I pressed play, and Marcus's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. I never meant for it to go down like that. The cop, I mean. Morrison. I was just supposed to scare him off, you know? But he kept pushing, kept asking questions about the robberies. He was getting too close to figuring out the whole operation. Linda Webb gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. On the recording, Marcus continued. So I followed him that night. Waited for him in the alley. I called out to him, and when he turned around, I shot him. Twice in the back. Made it look like he was ambushed during his investigation. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Linda Webb's quiet sobbing. Marcus was staring at the recorder as if it were a snake about to strike. But here's the thing, Marcus's recorded voice continued. I never told them about the others. The warehouse workers who saw too much. The security guard who was going to talk. They think Morrison was my only victim, but he wasn't. And when I get out of here, there are still some loose ends that need tying up. I stopped the recording and looked directly at Marcus. The person he was speaking to was FBI agent Rebecca Torres, working undercover as a prison reform advocate. Agent Torres had been cultivating Marcus for months, gaining his trust by appearing to believe in his innocence. I pulled out another set of documents. Based on this confession, the FBI reopened investigations into 3 unsolved murders from 2000 and 2001, all warehouse district employees, all shot with a .38 caliber revolver, all initially thought to be random crimes. The parole board members were frantically taking notes, their faces grim. Commissioner Hayes looked like she was already mentally drafting the denial letter. The ballistics analysis was conclusive, I continued. All 4 murders, including Detective Morrison's, were committed with the same weapon. A weapon that Marcus Webb threw into the Potomac River the night after he killed my partner. I reached into my folder one last time and pulled out a plastic evidence bag containing a severely corroded but still identifiable revolver. The weapon that was recovered by FBI divers last month, based on Marcus Webb's detailed description of where he disposed of it. The effect on Marcus was immediate and devastating. Whatever color had remained in his face drained away completely, and he slumped forward in his chair as if all the air had been knocked out of him. You see, Commissioner, I said, my voice now carrying the full weight of 23 years of suppressed emotion. Marcus Webb didn't just lie about killing my partner. He's a serial killer who has been planning his next victims from his prison cell. The FBI is currently investigating a network of former warehouse employees and their families who received anonymous threats over the past 5 years. Threats that stopped arriving only when prison authorities began monitoring Marcus's communications more closely. Linda Webb was openly weeping now, her world crumbling around her as the truth of who she'd been married to for 35 years finally came to light. I felt a stab of sympathy for her, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the satisfaction of finally seeing justice served. In addition to the murder charges, I continued, Marcus Webb is currently under federal investigation for conspiracy, witness intimidation, and making terrorist threats. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be filing new charges within the week. Commissioner Hayes was already reaching for her gavel. In light of this testimony and evidence, this board will take a brief recess to— Wait, Marcus interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me with eyes that were no longer defiant, just tired and defeated. "How long have you known?" I stared at him for a long moment, remembering Jamie's funeral, remembering the nightmares that had plagued me for years, remembering every sleepless night I'd spent wondering if we'd gotten the right man. "I've known you were guilty since the day we arrested you," I said quietly. "But I've known you were a serial killer for exactly 6 months, 2 weeks and 3 days. The day Agent Torres played me that recording." Marcus nodded slowly, as if that made perfect sense. "And you've been planning this moment ever since?" "Every single day," I confirmed. "Every single day for 23 years. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 2 decades of secrets finally brought to light. Marcus Webb, the man who had killed my partner and at least 3 other innocent people, was about to discover that his plans for freedom and revenge had been thoroughly, methodically, and irreversibly destroyed. But this was only the beginning. Because as I looked at the faces around the room, the horrified parole board members, the devastated wife, the calculating lawyer already planning damage control, I realized that the real reckoning was just getting started. I had spent 23 years preparing for this moment, but the story of how I'd gotten here, how I'd uncovered the truth about Marcus Webb's other victims, and how the FBI had helped me set the trap that would ensure he never saw freedom again, that story was just beginning to unfold. And Marcus Webb was about to learn that when you kill a cop's partner, you don't just destroy one life. You create an enemy who will spend the rest of her life making sure justice is served. No matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs, and no matter how many lies have to be unraveled to get to the truth. The recess was called, but I remained seated, watching as Marcus was led away in handcuffs for the first time in 23 years. His wife followed him with her eyes until he disappeared through the security door, then turned to look at me with a mixture of hatred and desperate confusion. "How could you do this to him?" she whispered. "How could you let me believe for all these years?" I closed my folder and stood up, feeling the weight of 2 decades of investigation and preparation settling on my shoulders. "Mrs. Webb," I said gently, "I didn't let you believe anything. Your husband lied to you for 35 years. I just made sure the truth finally came out." As I walked toward the exit, I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room following me. But I wasn't thinking about them anymore. I was thinking about Jamie Morrison and how I was finally going to be able to visit his grave and tell him that his killer would never hurt anyone again. The hunt was over. But the consequences of what I'd uncovered were just beginning to ripple outward, and Marcus Webb was about to discover that some secrets, once exposed, have the power to destroy everything you thought you knew about your life. Part 2 would reveal how I'd spent those 23 years methodically building my case, and how the FBI operation that caught Marcus confessing had been years in the making. But for now, justice had been served in that sterile hearing room, and that was enough. 3 hours after the parole hearing ended, I sat in my rental car outside Riverside Cemetery, staring at the granite headstone that had become as familiar to me as my own reflection. Detective James Morrison, beloved husband and father, taken too soon. The words never got easier to read, even after hundreds of visits over the years. My phone buzzed with a text from FBI agent Rebecca Torres. "Webb's been transferred to federal custody. Media's already picking up the story. You did it, Sarah." But sitting there in the gathering dusk, I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty, like a marathon runner who'd finally crossed the finish line only to realize they'd forgotten why they started running in the first place. 23 years of my life had been consumed by this case, this quest for justice that had cost me everything else I'd ever wanted. I closed my eyes and let myself remember the beginning, the moment that had set everything in motion. March 15th, 2001. I was Detective Sarah Chen, 28 years old and ambitious, partnered with Jamie Morrison for just over 2 years. He'd been assigned as my training officer when I made detective, and despite the 18-year age gap, we'd developed the kind of partnership that other cops envied. He was patient where I was impulsive, methodical where I was intuitive, experienced where I was eager. That night, we'd been tracking a pattern of armed robberies in the warehouse district. 5 hits in 3 months, all following the same pattern. Late-night security guards targeted during shift changes, minimal cash taken, but expensive equipment stolen and fenced through underground networks. Jamie had developed a theory that the robberies were connected to someone with inside knowledge of security protocols. "It's too clean," he'd said, spreading crime scene photos across our shared desk. "These aren't random hits. Somebody knows these buildings, knows the guard rotations, knows which warehouses have the good stuff." I'd been skeptical. "Could just be thorough surveillance, Jamie. These guys aren't exactly Navy SEALs." But Jamie had been right, as he usually was. We'd spent weeks interviewing security companies, warehouse managers, anyone with access to the kind of information the robbers would need. That's how we first encountered Marcus Webb. Marcus worked night security for Consolidated Storage, a mid-sized warehouse operation that housed everything from furniture to electronics. He'd been cooperative during our initial interview, even helpful. He'd provided detailed information about security protocols, suggested other warehouses that might be targets, offered to keep an eye out for suspicious activity. I should have seen the red flags then. Jamie did. "Something's off about that guy," he'd told me after our second interview with Marcus. "He's too eager to help, too knowledgeable about operations he shouldn't know about." "You think he's involved?" I'd asked. "I think he's worth watching," Jamie had replied. That was Jamie Morrison in a nutshell. Careful, thorough, always thinking 3 steps ahead. It's what made him such a good detective, and it's what should have kept him alive that night. Instead, his methodical approach to the investigation had made him a target. I opened my eyes and looked at his headstone again, remembering the phone call that had changed everything. March 15th, 11:47 p.m. I'd been at home, grading papers for the criminal justice course I taught part-time at the community college. When my phone rang, "Chen," I'd answered automatically. "Sarah, it's Captain Rodriguez. I need you to come in, now." The tone in his voice had made my blood run cold. "What's wrong?" "Jamie's been shot. He's—" A pause that lasted forever. He didn't make it. The next few hours had passed in a blur of police lights, crime scene tape, and the kind of controlled chaos that surrounds a cop killing. Jamie had been found in an alley behind Industrial Boulevard, shot twice in the back with a .38 caliber revolver. No witnesses, no surveillance cameras, no obvious motive beyond being a police officer in the wrong place at the wrong time. Except it wasn't random. Within hours, we'd discovered that Jamie had been conducting surveillance on Marcus Webb, following up on his suspicions about the warehouse robberies. His notes found in his patrol car detailed a pattern of behavior that suggested Marcus was feeding information to the robbery crew. The case against Marcus had come together quickly after that. Physical evidence placed him in the area around the time of the shooting. Witness testimony put him arguing with Jamie earlier that evening. His alibis fell apart under scrutiny. When we arrested him 3 days later, he'd seemed almost relieved, like he'd been expecting us. But even as the trial proceeded and Marcus was convicted, something gnawed at me. The evidence was solid but not overwhelming. Marcus maintained his innocence with a conviction that seemed genuine. And there were details that didn't quite fit the narrative we'd constructed. The night Marcus was sentenced to life in prison, I made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of my life. I was going to make absolutely certain we had the right man, and if we did, I was going to make sure he paid for every single thing he'd done. That decision cost me my first marriage. David Chen, my husband of 3 years, couldn't understand why I couldn't let the case go. "You got him, Sarah," he'd said during one of our final arguments. "The bastard's in prison for life. Jamie's been avenged. Why can't you move on?" But I couldn't explain to him what I barely understood myself. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about certainty. About knowing, beyond any shadow of doubt, that justice had been served. About making sure that every victim got counted, every crime got solved, every truth got told. The divorce was finalized in 2003, the same year I took my leave of absence from the police force to pursue graduate school. Officially, I was advancing my career, preparing for a future in forensic science and criminal justice education. Unofficially, I was transforming myself into the kind of investigator who could solve a case that had already been solved. Georgetown University's criminology program became my new base of operations. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that concerned my professors and classmates. While they were learning theory, I was applying it to Marcus Webb. While they were writing papers about criminal psychology, I was building psychological profiles of a killer I was convinced was hiding more victims. The breakthrough came in my second year, during a seminar on serial killer behavior patterns. Professor Martinez was discussing the concept of cooling-off periods between murders when something clicked in my mind. "The warehouse robberies," I'd said aloud. Interrupting the lecture, Professor Martinez had looked at me with mild annoyance. "I'm sorry, Miss Chen? The warehouse robberies in 2000 and 2001. What if they weren't just robberies? What if they were hunting grounds?" That night, I'd driven back to the police station and pulled every file related to the warehouse district cases. I spread them across the conference room table like pieces of a puzzle, looking for patterns I'd missed the first time around, and there they were, hidden in plain sight. Between August 2000 and March 2001, 5 warehouse employees had died in what appeared to be unrelated incidents. A security guard named Thomas Riley found shot in his car outside a convenience store. A dock worker named Maria Santos, killed in what looked like a mugging gone wrong. A warehouse supervisor named Robert Chen, shot during what police believed was a drug deal. All of them worked in the same industrial district. All of them had been killed with small-caliber weapons. All of their cases had gone cold within weeks of the murders. I spent the next 6 months developing a database that cross-referenced every aspect of these cases. Victim profiles, crime scene locations, ballistics reports, witness statements, everything. The picture that emerged was chilling. All 5 victims had worked night shifts in the warehouse district during the time period when Marcus Webb was employed by Consolidated Storage. All 5 had access to sensitive information about warehouse operations, security protocols, or valuable inventory. All 5 had died within a 2-week period of reporting suspicious activity to their supervisors or security companies. But the most damning connection was geographical. I created a map, plotting the location of each murder against the route Marcus would have taken traveling between his home and his workplace. Every single killing had occurred within a half-mile radius of his daily commute. The pattern was clear, but proving it would require more than circumstantial evidence and geographic profiling. I needed forensic proof, and that meant getting access to evidence that had been collecting dust in police storage facilities for years. That's when I learned the value of patience and legitimate authority. My PhD program gave me access to cold case files for academic research purposes. Growing reputation as a forensic consultant opened doors that would have remained closed to a retired detective with an obsession. By 2007, I had obtained ballistics evidence from all 5 unsolved murders. The bullets were too damaged for conclusive matching, but they were consistent with .38 caliber ammunition. More importantly, I'd tracked down witness statements that had been overlooked or dismissed during the original investigations. Maria Santos's coworker remembered her, mentioning some weird guy who'd been asking questions about warehouse schedules. Robert Chen's supervisor recalled him reporting suspicious activity near loading docks. Thomas Riley's wife mentioned strange phone calls in the weeks before his death. Each piece of evidence was small, insufficient on its own to reopen cold cases. But together, they painted a picture of Marcus Webb as a serial killer who'd used his security job to identify targets and his knowledge of police procedures to avoid detection. The challenge was proving it. Marcus was already in prison, serving life without parole. Even if I could prove he'd committed additional murders, it wouldn't change his sentence or bring his other victims justice. What I needed was a way to make him confess, to force him to reveal the truth about his crimes. That's when I reached out to the FBI. Agent Rebecca Torres was a specialist in cold case investigations and undercover operations. When I presented my research to her in 2010, she was initially skeptical. You're asking me to commit significant resources to proving that a man already serving life in prison killed 5 additional people, she'd said, reviewing my files. Even if you're right, what's the practical benefit? The practical benefit, I'd replied, is knowing the truth and ensuring that Marcus Webb never gets the chance to kill again. It took 3 years to convince the Bureau to authorize the operation. 3 years of presentations, peer reviews, and bureaucratic negotiations. But eventually, the combination of my evidence and the FBI's own analysis of similar cases convinced them that Marcus Webb warranted investigation. The undercover operation began in 2013, 12 years after Jamie's murder. Agent Torres, operating under the identity of Rebecca Miller, began corresponding with Marcus as a prison reform advocate who believed in his innocence. The relationship developed slowly, carefully, over months of letters and supervised visits. Marcus was lonely, isolated, desperate for contact with someone who believed his claims of innocence. Rebecca played her role perfectly, expressing outrage at his conviction, asking detailed questions about the evidence against him, gradually gaining his trust. The breakthrough came in year 2 of the operation. Marcus, emboldened by what he perceived as Rebecca's unwavering support, began sharing details about his case that hadn't been made public. He knew things about the crime scene that only the killer would know. He made references to evidence that had never been disclosed to the defense. But he was careful, never admitting guilt directly, always maintaining his innocence while simultaneously revealing knowledge that proved his guilt. "The thing that frustrates me most," he'd told Rebecca during one recorded visit, "is that they think Morrison just stumbled onto me by accident. Like he was some kind of lucky cop who happened to figure out the pattern." "What pattern?" Rebecca had asked innocently. "The warehouse jobs?" Morrison thought he was so smart, connecting the dots between the security schedules and the robberies. But he never realized how much more there was to connect. It was the closest thing to a confession we'd gotten, but it wasn't enough. We needed Marcus to admit not just to Jamie's murder, but to the other killings. We needed him to provide details that would allow us to close those cold cases and bring peace to other families who'd been waiting for answers. The final phase of the operation required a different approach. Rebecca began expressing concerns about her own safety, suggesting that she'd discovered evidence that could exonerate Marcus, but that mysterious figures were trying to silence her. She hinted that former warehouse employees were being threatened to maintain their silence about what they'd witnessed. Marcus's response was immediate and telling. Instead of confusion or concern, he showed detailed knowledge of who might be threatening her and why. He began providing specific names of people who'd seen too much back in 2000 and 2001. He described exact methods by which these witnesses might be discouraged from speaking out. And finally, during a visit 6 months ago, he'd provided the confession that sealed his fate. Sitting in my car outside the cemetery, I pulled out the transcript of that final recording. I'd memorized every word, but I still read it periodically, reminding myself that the obsession that had consumed my life had ultimately served a purpose. "I never meant for it to go down like that," Marcus had said, believing he was speaking to a trusted ally who was planning to help him appeal his conviction. "The cop, I mean, Morrison. I was just supposed to scare him off, you know." But he kept pushing, kept asking questions about the robberies. He was getting too close to figuring out the whole operation. The whole operation. Not just the robberies, but the murders. The systematic elimination of witnesses who might have connected Marcus to the crimes. So I followed him that night, waited for him in the alley. I called out to him, and when he turned around, I shot him. Twice in the back. Made it look like he was ambushed during his investigation. Even reading it now, years later, those words still made my hands shake with rage. Jamie had been murdered not because he was getting close to solving the robberies, but because he was getting close to uncovering the murders that had preceded them. "But here's the thing," Marcus had continued. "I never told them about the others. The warehouse workers who saw too much. The security guard who was going to talk. They think Morrison was my only victim, but he wasn't. 5 additional murders, just as I'd suspected. Thomas Riley, Maria Santos, Robert Chen, and two others whose identities Marcus had never revealed. People who'd died because they'd witnessed something that threatened Marcus's operation. And when I get out of here, Marcus had concluded, sealing his fate with his own words, there are still some loose ends that need tying up. The recording had provided everything we needed. Confessions to multiple murders, details that matched our cold case files, and most damning of all, proof that Marcus was planning to kill again upon his release. Within weeks of receiving the recording, FBI teams had recovered the murder weapon from the Potomac River, exactly where Marcus had described disposing of it. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the same gun had been used in all the murders Marcus had confessed to. Cold cases that had languished for decades were finally closed, bringing a measure of peace to families who'd waited 20 years for answers. My phone buzzed again, bringing me back to the present. Another text from Agent Torres. Press conference at 8 p.m. U.S. Attorney wants you there. You're the hero of this story, Sarah. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who'd spent 23 years of her life proving that evil exists, and that sometimes justice requires more than legal proceedings and courtroom victories. Sometimes it requires the kind of obsessive dedication that destroys everything else in your life, but ultimately serves a purpose greater than personal happiness. I started the car and pulled away from the cemetery, leaving Jamie's grave for what I knew would be one of the last times. The case was closed, the killer was caught, and the truth had finally been told. Now I had to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. 6 months after the parole hearing, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror at 5:30 a.m., preparing for what would be the final day of Marcus Webb's sentencing hearing on the new federal charges. The face staring back at me looked older than my 51 years, marked by decades of sleepless nights and relentless pursuit of a truth that had finally been acknowledged by the world. Today, Marcus Webb would be sentenced for the murders of Thomas Riley, Maria Santos, Robert Chen, and two other victims whose identities had emerged during the FBI investigation. Today, the families of his victims would finally hear someone take responsibility for destroying their lives. And today, I would close the chapter on an obsession that had defined me for more than half my adult life. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Torres. Victim impact statements start at 9 a.m. You ready for this? I typed back, as ready as I'll ever be. But the truth was more complicated. Over the past 6 months, as the media attention intensified and the additional charges were filed, I'd begun to realize that solving Jamie's murder hadn't brought me the peace I'd expected. Instead, it had left me facing a fundamental question I'd avoided for 23 years. Who was I without this case to consume my life? The press conference following Marcus's arrest had made me a minor celebrity in law enforcement circles. The detective who never gave up read the headline in the Washington Post. Cold case obsession leads to serial killer's confession, proclaimed the FBI's press release. Speaking requests poured in from police academies, criminology conferences, and victim advocacy groups. But sitting in my empty apartment, surrounded by boxes of evidence I no longer needed to maintain, I felt anything but triumphant. I'd spent 2 decades building a case against a killer, but I'd forgotten to build a life for myself. The divorce from David had been just the beginning. My relationship with my sister Jennifer had deteriorated as I'd become increasingly consumed by the investigation. Friends had drifted away as I'd repeatedly canceled social engagements to pursue leads or review evidence. I'd turned down job opportunities that would have taken me away from the Webb case, choosing consulting work that allowed me to maintain my flexibility and focus. I'd told myself it was all necessary, all justified by the importance of finding the truth. And maybe it was. But now that the truth was known, I was left to confront the reality of what that dedication had cost me. The courthouse was packed when I arrived. News vans lined the street, reporters with microphones clustered around the entrance, and a steady stream of people filed through security. I recognized some faces from the original investigation, retired cops who'd worked the warehouse district cases, family members of the victims who'd waited decades for answers. Linda Webb sat in the front row with her adult children, her face drawn and aged beyond her years. Over the past 6 months, as more details of her husband's crimes had emerged, she'd aged decades. The woman who'd believed so fiercely in Marcus's innocence had been forced to confront not just his guilt, but the realization that she'd been married to a serial killer for 35 years. She caught my eye as I entered the courtroom, and for a moment, I saw something unexpected in her expression. Not hatred, not blame, but a weary kind of gratitude. Later, I would understand why. Marcus was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, looking every bit the broken old man he'd become. The confident facade he'd maintained during the parole hearing was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of someone who'd finally run out of lies to tell. His lawyer, a different attorney now since Thomas Brennan had withdrawn from the case after the confession recordings became public, sat beside him with the resigned expression of someone defending the indefensible. Marcus had pled guilty to all charges in exchange for life sentences running concurrently with his existing conviction, avoiding the death penalty but ensuring he would never see freedom again. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to Jamie, despite the name, called the court to order. She was known for her fairness and her particular attention to victim impact statements, which made her the perfect choice for this sentencing. Before we proceed with sentencing, she announced, the court will hear victim impact statements from family members of the deceased. The first to speak was Thomas Riley's daughter, Patricia. She was in her 40s now, but when I looked at her, I could see the teenager who'd lost her father 24 years ago. My father was a good man, she began, her voice steady but emotional. He worked nights to support our family, to make sure my brother and I could go to college. He was killed 3 weeks before my high school graduation. For 24 years, we didn't know why. We didn't know who. We just knew that someone had decided my father's life was worth less than whatever they wanted to take from him. She turned to look at Marcus, who kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Now we know it wasn't random. Now we know you killed him because he saw something that threatened your operation. You took my father away from us not because you needed money or because you were desperate, but because his existence was inconvenient for you. Patricia's statement was followed by Maria Santos's brother, who spoke in both English and Spanish about a sister who'd immigrated to America seeking a better life, only to be murdered by a man who saw her as nothing more than a loose end to tie up. Robert Chen's widow, elderly now but still sharp, delivered perhaps the most devastating statement of all. She described 24 years of wondering why her husband had been killed, of raising 3 children alone while questioning whether there was something she could have done to prevent his death. I blamed myself, she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. I thought maybe if I'd convinced him not to work that late shift, if I'd made him find a different job, if I'd done something different, he'd still be alive. Now I know that none of that would have mattered. You had already decided he was going to die. As each family member spoke, I watched Marcus's reaction. He sat motionless, occasionally closing his eyes but never looking up at the people whose lives he'd destroyed. I'd seen this before in other killers, the inability or unwillingness to face the human cost of their actions. But something was different about this sentencing hearing. Usually, victim impact statements were followed immediately by the defendant's allocution and then sentencing. Today, Judge Morrison had scheduled an additional session. The court will now hear from individuals whose testimony was instrumental in bringing these crimes to light, she announced. Agent Torres spoke first, outlining the FBI investigation and praising the cooperation of local law enforcement. She was professional, thorough, and careful to credit the teamwork that had made the case possible. Then Judge Morrison called my name. I'd prepared remarks, bullet points about the importance of never giving up on cold cases and the value of interagency cooperation. But standing at the podium, looking out at the faces of people who'd waited decades for answers, I found myself setting aside my notes. Your Honor, I began. 23 years ago, I was a young detective who lost her partner to a killer. For the past 2 decades, I've dedicated my life to ensuring that Marcus Webb never had the opportunity to harm anyone else. I paused, looking at the families in the gallery. But this case isn't about me. And it isn't about my dedication or my investigation. It's about 6 people who died because Marcus Webb decided their lives were obstacles to his criminal enterprise. It's about families who spent decades without answers, without closure, without justice. I turned to face Marcus directly, forcing him to meet my eyes. Marcus Webb, you killed my partner, Detective James Morrison, because he was doing his job. You killed Thomas Riley, Maria Santos, Robert Chen, and 2 others because they witnessed your crimes and threatened your operation. You spent 23 years in prison lying about your guilt while planning to kill again upon your release. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since the parole hearing. Today, that ends. Today, these families finally have answers. Today, justice is served not just for Jamie Morrison, but for all of your victims. I returned to my seat, feeling simultaneously drained and relieved. The formal part of my involvement in this case was over. Judge Morrison's sentencing was swift and decisive. Marcus Webb, you have pled guilty to 5 counts of murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, and numerous related charges. The court sentences you to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, to run concurrently with your existing state conviction. She paused, looking directly at Marcus. Mr. Webb, you are now 71 years old. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in federal prison. You will never again have the opportunity to harm another human being. This court finds that justice has been served for your victims and their families. As Marcus was led away for the final time, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The case that had defined my adult life was finally, truly, completely closed. But as the courtroom emptied and I gathered my things, I was approached by someone I hadn't expected to speak with. Dr. Chen? Linda Webb's voice was soft, hesitant. Could I have a moment? I turned to face the woman who'd spent 23 years defending a serial killer. Unsure what to expect. I wanted to thank you, she said, her eyes filling with tears. Mrs. Webb, please, she interrupted. Let me say this. For 23 years, I believed my husband was innocent. I visited him every month. I wrote letters to parole boards. I spent our savings on appeal lawyers. I made our children believe their father was wrongfully convicted. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. When you played that recording at the parole hearing, when I heard Marcus confess to killing your partner and those other people, I wanted to hate you. I wanted to blame you for destroying my family's faith in his innocence. I waited, unsure how to respond. But then I realized something, she continued. You didn't destroy our faith in his innocence. You freed us from a lie we'd been living for 23 years. My children don't have to spend the rest of their lives fighting for a father who was never the man we thought he was. I don't have to wonder anymore whether the justice system made a mistake. She looked up at me with eyes that held pain, but also something like peace. The truth hurts, Dr. Chen, but it's better than living a lie. Thank you for giving us the truth, even though it cost us everything we thought we knew about the man we loved. Linda Webb walked away, leaving me standing alone in the empty courtroom, processing her words. For 23 years, I'd been focused on proving Marcus's guilt, on serving justice for Jamie and the other victims. I'd never considered that the truth might also serve as a form of mercy for the people who'd been unknowingly living with lies. 6 weeks later, I was cleaning out my home office when I found a letter that had been forwarded from my old university address. The return address was unfamiliar, but when I opened it, I immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Patricia Riley, Thomas Riley's daughter, the woman who'd spoken so powerfully at Marcus's sentencing. Dr. Chen, she'd written, I wanted you to know that my family finally held a proper memorial service for my father last weekend. For 24 years, we couldn't bring ourselves to have a celebration of his life because we didn't know who had taken it from us or why. We couldn't find peace because we didn't have answers. Now we do. Now we know that my father died because he was a good man, who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, who saw something that a killer needed to keep secret. We know that his death wasn't random, wasn't meaningless, wasn't forgotten, because of your work, because of your refusal to let this case go cold. My family can finally grieve properly, and Remember my father's life instead of being consumed by the mystery of his death. Thank you for giving us our father back. I set the letter down and looked around my office, now mostly empty except for a few boxes of personal items. In 2 weeks, I would start a new job as director of the National Cold Case Initiative, a federal program designed to help local law enforcement agencies solve decades-old murders using modern forensic techniques and investigative methods. The position would allow me to apply everything I'd learned, from the Webb case to help other families find the answers they'd been seeking. It would give purpose to the obsession that had consumed my adult life, channeling it into something constructive rather than destructive. But more importantly, it would let me move forward while still honoring the memory of Detective James Morrison and all the other victims whose cases had gone unsolved for too long. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Agent Torres's name appeared on the screen. Sarah, I wanted to give you a heads up. The Innocence Project has reached out to the Bureau. They want to use your methodology to review other cases where convicted killers might be connected to unsolved murders. I smiled, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades, excitement about the future rather than obsession with the past. Tell them I'm interested, I said. But they'll have to wait until next month. I start my new job in 2 weeks. The federal position? That's great news. You'll be perfect for it. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Rebecca Torres was right. I would be perfect for the job, not despite my obsession with the Webb case, but because of it. I'd learned how to dig deeper than surface evidence, how to see patterns that others missed, how to persist when conventional wisdom said to give up. But I'd also learned the cost of that persistence. The new position would require me to maintain boundaries, to work cases thoroughly but not exclusively, to serve justice without sacrificing everything else in my life. I walked to my window and looked out at the city where I'd spent the past 23 years building a case against a serial killer. Somewhere out there were other detectives working other cases, other families waiting for answers, other killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder. My work wasn't finished. It was just beginning on a larger scale, with better resources and, hopefully, with the wisdom that comes from learning the difference between dedication and obsession. That evening, I drove to Riverside Cemetery one last time as a private citizen seeking closure. Jamie's headstone looked exactly the same as it had on my first visit 23 years ago, but I felt completely different standing before it. It's over. Jamie? I said aloud, not caring if anyone heard me talking to a gravestone. Marcus Webb will never hurt anyone again. The other families finally have their answers. Justice was served. I placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the headstone, the same kind I'd brought every month for over 2 decades. I'm moving on now, I continued. I'm taking a new job, starting a new chapter. But I'll never forget what you taught me about being a good detective, about fighting for victims, about never giving up on the truth. As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. The case that had defined my life was closed, the killer was behind bars forever, and the families had their answers. Most importantly, I'd learned that justice served cold could still burn bright enough to illuminate the path forward. Marcus Webb had killed 6 people and destroyed countless more lives through his crimes and his lies. But in the end, his evil had been exposed, his victims had been remembered, and the truth had prevailed. Some stories end with revenge. Others end with redemption. This one ended with something rarer and more valuable: resolution. Not just for the case, but for everyone whose life had been touched by Marcus Webb's violence. The chapter was closed, but the book wasn't finished. And for the first time in 23 years, I was looking forward to writing the next page. 2 years later, I stood in my new office at the National Cold Case Initiative headquarters in Quantico, reviewing a stack of case files that had been submitted by local law enforcement agencies across the country. Each file represented a family waiting for answers, a detective who'd run out of leads, a victim whose story deserved to be told. The knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. Agent Torres entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone with good news. The Henderson case in Oregon, she announced, setting one cup on my desk. Local PD just arrested the suspect based on your DNA analysis recommendations. 30-year-old cold case, solved in 6 months using your methodology. I smiled, feeling the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with bringing closure to a long unsolved case. But it was different now, cleaner, healthier. I could celebrate the victory without being consumed by it, without letting it define my entire existence. That makes 12 this quarter, I said, updating the statistics board on my wall. We're ahead of schedule. The National Cold Case Initiative had exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. The systematic approach I'd developed during my investigation of Marcus Webb, combining traditional detective work with modern forensic science, psychological profiling, and interagency cooperation, had proven remarkably effective when applied to other unsolved cases. But more importantly, I'd learned to manage teams, delegate responsibilities, and maintain the kind of work-life balance that had been impossible during my obsessive pursuit of Webb. I had dinner plans with my sister Jennifer next week, the first time we'd spoken regularly in over a decade. I'd started dating again, tentatively exploring the possibility of companionship after years of solitude. There's something else, Rebecca said, settling into the chair across from my desk. I got a call from the Justice Department this morning. They want to expand the program nationally, establish regional centers in major metropolitan areas. I leaned back in my chair, considering the implications. That would be a significant expansion. We'd need additional funding, more personnel, standardized training protocols. They're prepared to offer all of that. But they want you to head the entire program. National Director, based here in Quantico but overseeing operations across the country. The offer was tempting, representing the kind of career advancement that most law enforcement professionals could only dream of. But I'd learned to be cautious about opportunities that might consume my life the way the Webb case had. What's the timeline? I asked. They want an answer by the end of the month. Implementation would begin next fiscal year, I nodded, making a mental note to discuss it with my therapist. Dr. Amanda Foster had been instrumental in helping me process the psychological aftermath of the Webb case and develop healthier coping mechanisms. Our weekly sessions had taught me to recognize the difference between dedication and obsession, between seeking justice and seeking revenge. I'll consider it, I told Rebecca, but I want to make sure I'm taking the position for the right reasons. After she left, I returned to the case files on my desk. Each one told a story of violence interrupted, of lives cut short, of families left with questions that had haunted them for years or decades. But now I could read these files with professional detachment while still maintaining empathy for the victims and their families. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it instead. Dr. Chen, this is Patricia Riley. I hope you remember me from my father's case. I wanted you to know that I just graduated from law school and will be starting as a prosecutor in the district attorney's office next month. Your work on my father's case inspired me to pursue a career in criminal justice. Thank you for showing me that even the oldest wounds can heal when the truth is finally told. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment and everything to do with the ripple effects of seeking justice. Patricia Riley had transformed her family's tragedy into a calling, just as I had transformed my obsession with Webb into a broader mission to help others find closure. That evening, I drove to Riverside Cemetery for my monthly visit to Jamie's grave. It had become a tradition, not the desperate pilgrimage of my earlier years, but a peaceful ritual of remembrance and reflection. The cemetery was quiet, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. I placed fresh flowers at Jamie's headstone and settled into the folding chair I now brought with me for these visits. The Henderson case closed today, I told him, speaking aloud as I always did during these visits. 30-year-old murder in Oregon. The victim's daughter was about the same age as Patricia Riley when her father was killed. She'll finally have answers now. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree that shaded Jamie's grave, and I smiled at the fanciful thought that he was listening, approving of the work I was doing in his memory. The Justice Department wants to expand the program, I continued. Make it national. Part of me is tempted. Think of how many families we could help, how many cases we could solve. But part of me remembers what happened the last time I let a case consume my life. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos from my sister's birthday party last month, the first family gathering I'd attended in over a decade. Jennifer and I laughing together, her children treating me like the aunt I'd never had the chance to be, her husband welcoming me into their home as if I'd never been absent from their lives. I think you'd want me to take the promotion, I said, looking up at Jamie's name carved in granite. But you'd also want me to remember that justice isn't worth achieving if it costs you everything else that makes life worth living. As the sun set and the cemetery grew quiet around me, I made my decision. I would take the national director position, but with conditions. Clear boundaries between work and personal life, mandatory vacation time, a commitment to maintaining the relationships I'd rebuilt over the past 2 years. Marcus Webb had taken Jamie's life, but I wouldn't let him take mine as well. Not anymore. Standing to leave, I placed my hand briefly on Jamie's headstone. Thank you for teaching me what it means to be a good detective. And thank you for showing me that even the darkest cases can lead to something positive if you're willing to learn and grow from them. As I walked back to my car, I felt the familiar sense of peace that had replaced the obsessive drive that had once defined me. The Marcus Webb case would always be part of my story, but it was no longer the only chapter. I had work to do, families to help, and a life to live. The past had been resolved. The future was full of possibility, and for the first time in 25 years, that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out! And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.